Welcome to a special episode of Animals, Nature, and You. I'm your host, Rick Schwartz, and the reason this episode is special, well, it's a replay from back on. I believe it aired or was released back in April. The reason for the replay, as you might notice if you're watching on YouTube, background is similar yet different. I just recently moved, still unpacking. If you're watching on YouTube, you can see the lighting's still a little bit off, trying to figure out what to do with the window on my left. And if you've been listening for a while, you know 10 Minute Tuesdays is taking a bit of a hiatus because of the move. This is the last sort of hiccup, if you will. Starting next week, all new episodes. 10 Minute Tuesdays will be coming back, and we're going to just hit the ground running. We have so many great conversations coming up for you to listen to. I'm not going to keep going on. I'm going to jump into this episode with David Mizejewski. He is so knowledgeable about bees and our native wildlife and gardening and what we can do. So much is covered in this episode. I hope you enjoy it if you haven't already watched it or listened to it. And again, if you have, I think it's worth a rewatch. So here we go.
If each of us did that, even in a little small way, we would exponentially increase the amount of habitat, and we would see more beautiful songbirds and hear them, right? We would be seeing more beautiful butterflies. We would be seeing more of these native bees doing this really incredibly important ecological work of pollinating nature, right? That's feeding everybody else up and down the food webs, including us.
Welcome to another episode of Animals, Nature, and You. And as you know, my name is Rick Schwartz, and I'm really happy you're here because, well, this is April 30th when this comes out. We are officially a 3-month-old podcast, and it continues to grow. And so if you're new here, if you're just joining us now, thank you for showing up. I appreciate it. For those of you who've been along since the beginning of January, you're awesome. I appreciate you and everyone we've collected along the way. And I know this because I can see the numbers of how it grows. And every month we have more and more listeners. And that's because you're sharing this. That's because you're telling people about it. You're finding this podcast interesting enough that you're going to share an episode or something with someone. And I appreciate that tremendously. The goal of this podcast from the beginning has always been to make a difference, to highlight the things about animals, nature, and you, because we're all connected. Animals, nature, and humans, we're all one. Nature's not over there. Nature's not something we go visit. We are in it. Now, yes, sometimes we're in our buildings, in our houses, in our offices or schools. It doesn't feel like nature. It doesn't feel like there's animals around. But everything we do has an impact and is a part of that. And sometimes we're surprised when we have the opportunity to learn a little more about nature. And that's why I asked David to come back on the show. Well, actually, this is David's first time on the show. David Mizejewski and I have known each other for a long time. We used to do very similar work, going on TV all the time, educating people about wildlife. He's been with the National Wildlife Federation for a long time and is still doing amazing work. And we did a live together on Instagram back in November talking about their Leave the Leaves program. In other words, encouraging people not to rake up the leaves because that's where a lot of animals will spend time, insects and other bugs and things that are important for springtime animals to be the food source. So whether it's something that's going to winter down in the mulch of the leaves or lay its eggs there or whatever it might be. So we had this whole discussion about that and how important that was. And as we're wrapping up, he's like, oh, by the way, I should tell you about all the different things you don't know about bees. And I was like, wait, what? So here we are. We are going to have a conversation with David Mizejewski about bees, and I'm super excited about it. Here's the thing. Okay, listen for how many species of bees there are other than the honeybee. Listen for what you can do for these bees and why they're so important for us. And also the fact that most bees, well, not most, a good majority of them don't sting. I think I'll have to ask him if it's the majority don't or the majority. Either way, it's going to be a great talk. I want to do a quick intro here, read you his bio so you have an idea, just in case you don't know who David is. And if you don't, I'll let it pass this time. But after this episode, you're going to want to know more about him. And I'll have all the links and everything down in the show notes below, so don't worry about that. David Mizejewski is a lifelong naturalist. He spent his youth exploring suburban woods, fields, and wetlands, observing and learning about surprising diversity of wildlife that inhabits all those spaces. He then went on to get his degree in human and natural ecology from Emory University. And to date, David is a television host, an author with a lot of great books. We'll have to ask him about that. And a naturalist with the National Wildlife Federation. He has hosted a series on Animal Planet and on Nat Geo Wild. He's been on all the shows, Conan O'Brien, The Martha Stewart Show, NBC's Today Show, Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom, and so on. So many more, I'm sure of it, because I remember watching him quite a bit. He is dedicated to using his knowledge and enthusiasm to help others understand and support wildlife and the natural world. And I have to say too, I can sit and listen to you, David. We have these conversations, and normally I'm the one that has to talk all the time. So I'm really excited you're here. Thank you so much for taking the time to be on Animals, Nature, and You.
Absolutely. I love coming on your shows and chatting about nature and getting the word out to everybody. So I'm thrilled to be here.
And you do it so well. And to reference what you just mentioned, back when I initially had gotten laid off from work, I just started getting on Instagram Lives and getting a hold of people saying, hey, let's talk about this. You were nice enough last November to join me on Instagram Live. We talked about the campaign the National Wildlife Federation was doing, which was the Leave the Leaves, and so many great tips and reasons why we want to leave that mulch, that natural mulch, those leaves for wildlife, for the bugs that turn into caterpillars that are food for songbirds. As we were wrapping up, we just finished, we did talk a little bit about pollinators, and you're like, oh, we also need to talk about why everything you think you know about bees is wrong. And I was like, yes.
Yes, exactly.
So here we are, many, many months later. We finally were able to get scheduled. We're sitting here at the end of April, which I think is a really good time to talk about bees. And my knowledge of bees is that we have a lot of different wild native species that don't act like the honeybee. And I know that honeybees were imported from Europe, so they're technically not a native species. They do help with a lot of pollination. So lay it on us. What do we need to know about this? What's going on?
Well, first, I want to say I love that I'm back now, because you're right. Back in the fall, we were celebrating at the National Wildlife Federation Leave the Leaves Month. And as you said, that's all about, why our fallen leaves are actually really important habitat for all sorts of wildlife, moths and all sorts of insects that overwinter in them, and birds that forage in them. And, all of those critters that are overwintering are now emerging and are becoming the main food source for 96% of our backyard birds. So if you want to see birds in your yard, you got to keep those leaves. One of the groups of insects that actually use those leaves are bumblebees. And so as we're wrapping up April, next month, the month of May, the National Wildlife Federation's next big campaign is called Garden for Wildlife Month. So you're right. It couldn't be more timely for us to be talking about this, because all of those bees are emerging. They're out there doing the pollination work, and there's so many things that we can do to help support them. And so we can talk more about that after I dispel all of the myths about bees. So you started in the right spot.
Okay, perfect.
And so the thing is that I'll kind of, a spoiler, right? The spoiler is that what we generally as a society know about bees is really based on one bee, and that is the European honeybee. And that is the bee, like you said, that, we imported from Europe for its agriculture services. So, its pollination services of crops, its production of honey, which we all love to eat. Beeswax too, is an important product. And so, when Europeans colonized North America, they brought over these bees that they had back in Europe. And, but here's the thing, as you mentioned, they're not a native species here. And at the National Wildlife Federation, we really do focus on our native indigenous flora and fauna when it comes to conservation. And so honeybees are actually, they remain hugely important for agriculture. They are pollinating a lot of our food crops, but, they're not really wildlife in the sense that, a cow is not wildlife. And so, or a chicken is not wildlife. Honeybees are really a semi-domesticated animal. And in North America, they largely exist in managed hives by people. So they're not really wildlife. And I think that's the first thing for people to kind of wrap their minds around, because you hear a lot about, colony collapse disorder, and, honeybees are disappearing. And then people are like, what's the National Wildlife Federation doing about it? And we're not doing anything about that, because for the same reason we're not trying to save heritage breed cows, or worrying about the chicken population, right? It's not wildlife. It's an important ag issue, and the ag folks, that's their area, right? But at the same time, here in North America, we've got almost 4,000 different wild native bee species out of 20,000 bee species on the planet, right? And so the honeybee, in large part, is completely different, the complete exception to the rule for what it means to actually be a bee, that applies to the vast majority of those 20,000 bee species on the planet and the 4,000 that we have here in North America.
I think, just real quick, jumping in, 4,000 different species here in North America. I can say, as someone who's worked in wildlife education and with animals, and albeit bugs, insects, and whatnot have never been my specialty, always curious and love them and love to talk to an entomologist, but I had no idea there were 4,000 different species.
Yeah.
I do know, though, enough that there are a lot of the bee species that are native. They don't look like what we traditionally think are a bee.
Well, this is my first myth busting thing, right? About, everything you think you know about bees. There's really like 5 things that if you
Okay.
ask anybody on the street, tell me about a bee, they're going to say things like, oh, bees are, black and yellow and striped, right? Bees live in hives and they have queens and they make honey and they'll sting you, right?
Right.
Those
The
4
singer.
things, right? That's actually not true for all, like, the vast majority of bees. Those things don't really apply. So let's tick through them one at a time, and we'll
Yeah,
start
let's
with
do it.
that sort of color thing, right? And so the whole black and yellow or brown and yellow type striping that you see on honeybees, it does exist in many bee species in some way, shape, or form, but many bees do not look anything like that. And so, to your point a minute ago, there are all these bees flying out around there that you probably have seen and you had no idea it was a bee. And so bees come in metallic green and blue and black and red and metallic gold and all sorts of other combinations than that, what we think of as a bee, which is that, sort of yellow and black striping. That when we're kids, we color the bee with our yellow crayon.
Right.
Um, and so yeah, that's the first one, is that bees are, have a wide diversity of colors. And I'll add on to that too, is they come in a wide range of sizes too. So a honeybee is probably, I would say, sort of like a medium-sized bee. On the bigger end, you've got the bumblebees and you've got the carpenter bees, who could be, 2, 3, 4 times the size of a honeybee. But on the other end of the spectrum, many of our native bees are actually super tiny. They're these little itty bitty, maybe half the size of a honeybee or even smaller. There's actually, I don't know the exact dimensions, but there's the Perdita bee. It doesn't even have a common name. That's its genus name. I think is the smallest bee species, and it's just like super, super tiny, like, the size of a period or something like that. All the way up to these, giant carpenter bees, which can be, an inch and a half or longer, big burly bees. And so bees not only come in a wide diversity of colors, they also come in a wide variety of shapes and sizes too. So that's kind of the first thing, I think, to get you over the idea of like bees are black and yellow and they're all this big. No, that's not true. Um, but the the next batch of myths or things that we think we know about bees, but actually don't apply to most bees, really have to do with the whole social aspect of honeybees, or it's technically called eusocial, EUSOCIAL.
Mhm.
Um, and what that means is that it's a behavior where these bees have, like, they live communally and they have sort of separation of labor, right? So in a honeybee colony, they form a hive, they make the beeswax. The queen is in there. Her job is to mate and then with the male and then lay eggs. And that's what she does. And then each of the different generations of bees that come out, they have like a whole work system, right? There are worker bees who are going out and gathering pollen, and there are guards, and there are brood bees that basically take care of the eggs and the babies and put them into the honeycomb in the little chambers and feed them honey and then cap it off when they pupate and all of that kind of thing, right? Most bees don't do that. So here's the thing: 90% of the bees on this planet are not living in those social hives. 90% of the bees on the planet don't have queens. They don't make honey. They don't live in hives. They're solitary. And so here's how it works for the majority of bees. You have an individual female bee, who emerges, and the bees are emerging now. They have been, for the last month or so, depending on how far north or south you are. But that individual female bee is emerging from her, where she pupated over winter in a little tube that, where she hatched and fed as a larva and then pupated and now is coming out, right? So the males actually emerge first, and they're kind of waiting around for when the females emerge. So they're ready to go. So the male and the female bee mates. That's the end of the story for the male. He's done his duty. He doesn't live for much longer after that, poor guys. But uh, the female then, now that she has mated, what she will do, and this varies a little bit from species to species, but what the solitary female bee is seeking is a tunnel. And most of these solitary bees are looking for a tunnel in the ground. Sometimes they'll excavate them. Sometimes they'll take advantage of tunnels made by other insects or critters, but a little narrow tunnel, again, depending on the size of the bee. And what she's going to do is she's going to go into that tunnel, and she will, well, actually, first, what she's going to do is going to fly around and visit flowers. And this is the part that, again, is true of most bee species, right? They are going to go out and they're going to go to flowers. They're going to drink the nectar. That's what fuels the adult bee, but they're going to gather a lot of that. And they're also going to gather pollen. And then they're going to take that nectar and pollen and roll it into like a little ball, which is called a bee loaf, which is just like so whimsical and cute, right? And she puts that little ball of nectar and pollen in the tunnel, and she will lay an egg on it. And then what she'll do is build a little chamber wall, and she'll continue that process and fill that tunnel with a whole series of little chambers with an egg and with a bee loaf in there. And then once she does that, then she's done. And she doesn't live that much longer after she completes that process. She does not stick around to protect or feed those babies at all. Nothing like, again, a honeybee would do. And so it's a radically different way of living than what most people think of as bees, because, again, no queens, no hives, no honey. And I mentioned 90% of our bees are solitary. So of that 90%, about 3/4 of them are nesting in the ground. The other quarter or so are nesting in hollowed out plant stems, so like last year's perennials. We'll talk about this, about what you can do to help support these bees in more detail in a minute. But they're going into those dead plant stems. They're going into a rotting log or even a dead standing tree that the termites are in, and the carpenter ants, and they're tunneling, and the woodpeckers are drilling holes to get after them. The bees are using all of those tunnels in that dead wood as well as nesting places. And so so those are the other three things, the no hives, no queens, no honey. And then that leads to the fifth thing. And that is the whole bit about, bees being dangerous and wanting to sting you and all of that. I mean, first of all, with honeybees, that's really not true either. So here's the deal with stingers. Stingers are actually a modified ovipositor. And an ovipositor is the structure on an insect, a female insect, that she uses to lay her eggs. And so with the especially with the honeybees, most of them are not laying eggs. So their ovipositor really is just a stinger. And most bees, most of those 20,000 bees, the females anyway, have the ability to sting. There's one little group of stingless bees. I don't know exactly the number of species, but it's a tiny percentage. But you got to ask yourself the question, why do bees sting? I mean, what do you think?
To defend themselves. It's a last-ditch effort to survive, or in the case of those that do have hives, it's a way to defend a hive if need be.
Right. Exactly. And that's really what it's all about. Stinging is not a like a proactive thing. It's not an offensive thing.
That's not their agenda.
Exactly. Like, they don't want to sting, especially honeybees, because honeybees die when they sting, because it actually rips out part of their abdomen. Most bees, that's not true of either. That's another thing that's not true about most bee species, is that they can sting multiple times, right? But you got to ask yourself, why would a bee sting, right? They're certainly not trying to eat us, right? And they're not going to, like, again, come after you, because why would they do that? Why would they waste the energy and put themselves in danger by coming close to this big giant human that, can squish them? So bees are stinging defensively, and the social bees, like the honeybee, are much more, sort of prone to stinging, because they have something to protect. They have invested so much time and energy to that hive, protecting their queen, that honey store, which is what the honeybees live on over the winter, and all of the babies in there, right? And this is true, by the way. Most of everything I'm saying about bees is also true of wasps. We'll have to do another episode on that, but the gist is the same. There are some wasps that are social. hornets, yellow jackets. There's going to be a bunch of them in a hive with a queen, and all of that good stuff. They're not making honey because wasps are pretty much carnivorous, and so at any rate, but the vast majority of wasps are solitary, and they're much, much, much less likely to ever sting you because they're not there to protect anything, right?
Right.
The only way these solitary bees and wasps will sting you is if you literally like grab them in your hand and try to squish them. It's not like, again, a honeybee hive where if you happen to bumble and stumble into it, the bees are going to come out and they're going to defend that hive, right? The rest of these solitary bees don't do that because they're not sticking around to protect the babies that are in the tunnel that the female made. And so it's really hard to get them to sting you. Another instance, maybe you step on it, right? That has
Right.
happened to me before. I did get stung by a bumblebee once because I was wearing flip-flops in my garden and a bumblebee kind of fell and landed underneath my flip-flop and she stung me on the foot, but not her fault, right?
Right.
So anyway, the whole everything you think you know about bees is wrong is really about those 5 things. And I have fun with it. I have a whole talk that I give. As you know, I do a lot of speaking engagements all around the country, and I have a whole little quiz that I do in a slide deck where I ask these questions, and I have people raise their hand. Is this true or false? All bees are black and yellow, and bees live in hives, and all that. And the answers, of course, are not a black and white true and false, right? It's most bees, right? And sometimes people get a little cranky about that because they're like, these are trick questions, right? Like, but I do that deliberately because if you're okay believing a whole bunch of things about all bees based on one kind of bee, then the idea that everything you thought you know about bees is wrong based on 90% of the rest of the bees, I'm okay with that, right? And of course, as you know, as an educator, those kinds of things make the information stick in people's brains.
Well, sure. You can present something like, here's a bunch of facts, or you can have some fun with it, make them think, give them the aha moments. Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. Make it interactive and that kind of thing. So yeah, I mean, that's really the gist of it. I mean, these bees are out there. Oh, actually, the other thing I want to say about this is that why is that the case? Why do most people only know these things about one kind of bee? And it goes back to what I was saying about honeybees being agriculturally important, which makes them economically important, which means, like every other economically important thing, they have a lobby, right? They have a PR agency out there, right?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of, professional organizations, beekeeping associations and things like that, that are, bringing the honeybee to the forefront of the media. And so, and that there's nothing wrong with that, right?
Right.
But what ends up happening again is that people believe these things that are not true about most of our other bee species, and in fact, they don't even know anything about these other bees. And the unfortunate reality is, like so many other wildlife species, many of our native bees are in trouble. They are disappearing before our eyes. Many of them, we don't even know what their population status is because there's just not the science being done to monitor and track it.
Right.
Because again, there's not funding behind it because there's not loads of money to be made on, these bees because they're wildlife. They're not being used for agriculture, et cetera. So I feel like it's partly my duty as a naturalist and, in my role at the National Wildlife Federation, we're about wildlife and, insects are wildlife. That's another thing that bees have going against them in sort of the conservation world. Like we think of wildlife as, bears and moose and,
Sure.
dolphins and, the furry, the charismatic megafauna, as we like to call them, right? And so, but insects are wildlife. They're animals. And they happen to be an incredibly important group of wildlife, bees in particular. So if you rewind back to, 60 plus million years ago, when flowering plants first started to emerge. In fact, it was even longer ago than that. I think it was in the Cretaceous, which is that middle period, of the sort of the age of the dinosaurs, right?
Right.
Well, I'm sorry. I think the Jurassic is the middle period. I have to double check myself on this. So if I would get this
Either
wrong,
way, it was a really long time ago.
really long time ago, right? With the emergence of flowering plants.
Yeah.
Because, flowering plants were not always around. For a huge portion of the history of life on Earth, there were no flowering plants. So in the Jurassic is when they first started to evolve. And then the wasps evolved first. And then out of the wasps, as more flowering plants came about and more wasps were learning that they could basically specialize in not hunting insects, but getting their protein from the pollen, a group of wasps basically specialized to the point where they, essentially became vegetarians. And those are the bees, right? So they feed on flower nectar and pollen. Although, side note, I did recently learn about the carnivorous vulture bee. And I want to give a shout out to Nat Geo, because they have this incredible new series, and there's an episode or a couple episodes. I think it's called The Secret Life of Bees. And in there, they feature these vampire bees that are a South American species, and they actually don't visit flowers. They eat carrion. And fascinatingly, they are one of the social bees that also make honey, and they make it out of dead, rotting animal flesh, not flower nectar. I don't know if I want to try that honey.
I don't
People
know
say
either.
it's good. It can be sweet, but they say
It's got
it's
that
like got more of
savory taste to
a
it.
savory note to it, as you would imagine. But anyway, the vast majority of these bees, that evolved from wasps are not, they're no longer eating other insects the way that wasps are. They're specializing. And as the bees specialize, they fueled the evolution of flowering plants. And so today, the ecosystems on this planet are largely sort of driven, the food webs anyway, by flowering plants. And something like 80 to 85% of flowering plants require an animal pollinator. And, there's all sorts of animals out there that are pollinating. Most of them are insects. So for anybody curious about, who are the pollinators, pollinators are animals. They visit flowers. For the reward of the nectar and the pollen, so sugar and protein, right? That's a food source. But plants are clever, right? They're smart. They figured out that they can't move from point A to point B themselves, right? Because plants don't really move like that, in order to mate, right? And so plants still do sexual reproduction. They have, male and female parts and, reproductive material that have to get from one place to the other. So this coevolution of largely bees, but a lot of other insects too, and flowering plants, was basically the process of plants figuring out how to use these dumb animals to allow them to have sex. I mean, that's really what pollination is, because when the animal moves the pollen from one flower to another, that pollen is the male reproductive material, and it then fertilizes the flower, and it allows flowering plants to reproduce. So then once those flowers are fertilized, many flowering plants package their seeds, which will be the next generation of that plant species, inside a delicious little snack in the form of a nut or a seed that has like a sunflower seed, or a berry or a fruit, right? And then they have tricked a whole other group of dumb animals to come and eat those food sources,
spread them around,
which has the seed in it. And the seed itself can travel through the digestive tract of that animal. And in fact, in some cases, it needs to go through the stomach juices to wear out the seed coating so that the little seedling can actually sprout. And then those animals disperse the seeds out around the world, right? So again, majority of our flowering plants, something like 80 to 85%, and the majority of plants are flowering plants too. You can do the math, right? It's really critically important that we have healthy pollinators for the functioning of our food webs that are supporting all the other wildlife species out there. Not just the animals that are eating the plant material, right? Not just the fruit bats that are eating the fruit, or, the animals that are feeding on the foliage, right? It's also all the animals that eat those animals, right? All the predators also rely on the pollinators. And so it is very true that if pollinators or even just bees disappeared tomorrow, life on this planet would come to a screeching halt pretty quickly. Within a year or two, there would be no food. And that includes us, right? We are part of the ecosystem. Human beings, even though we do a lot of awful things to it and to our fellow species, like, we rely on it just as much as everybody else. So bees are really important, and particularly our wild native bee species, because it's not the honeybees that are out there pollinating the plants in nature. It's our wild native bee species that are doing that. And so, the sad thing, like I was saying a few minutes ago, is that a lot of people don't know anything about these bees. They don't even know they exist, and they're disappearing. So that's why at the National Wildlife Federation, we are really focused on educating people about this and helping, raise awareness that many of our native bee species are disappearing, or again, we don't even know their conservation status. I mean, there's a bee that used to be really common across a big part of the upper Midwest and the Northeast called the rusty patched bumblebee. And just in the last few decades, it's disappeared. I think there's
Yeah.
like less than like 2% of the population that used to be there. And, this is due to habitat destruction, just trashing, developing, whole cloth destroying habitat, but also replacing it with our lawns that we love to spray
Mhm.
pesticides on, and replacing it with non-native plants that don't support our native bees in the same way that our native flora does, right? And then again, more pesticides, right? So these things are big factors in that. There's also competition and disease that comes from honeybees. So this is the one thing where, again, we love honeybees. They're really agriculturally important. We rely on them, but we have to be aware of the fact that honeybees, because they are generalists, they could basically nectar and gather pollen at any flower out there. And a lot of our native bees, that's not true. They specialize, and we could talk about that in a
Yes.
second too.
Mhm.
So the honeybees, and because there's so many of them, can actually outcompete some of our native bees for those nectar and pollen resources. And again, because they're raised in captivity and they're social and they're around each other, those are conditions where disease can spread. And there definitely are instances where they can spread some of those diseases to wild bees, and then that's another, just another stressor on them. So it's just something to keep in mind, especially for backyard beekeepers. Again, I love that, but that's like backyard chicken keeping. And so you
Yeah.
have to remember that if you're really trying to support nature and the pollinators, like getting a beehive is not really helping. Yeah, I'm not saying don't do it, but just
So
understand what it is and what it isn't.
right. So
Yeah.
that takes me right to what I want to ask you is someone listening to this and their head is now exploding because all these amazing facts you just dropped in a very short amount of time, and they're compelled to want to do something. The way you described the tunneling, the laying of the eggs, the bee bread, is there anything the average citizen who's now suddenly aware that there are these amazing native bees that they have just assumed were some sort of flying bug? Can anybody do something to help? Are there, other than, the obvious, which you just covered, let's minimize spraying pesticides. Let's try
Yeah.
and plant more native plants. And then goes back to what you said back in November, leave the leaves, leave the decaying plants, because those can be homes for these bees to do the reproductive cycle. In general, is there anything else we can do as either a homeowner, or you're in an apartment with a patio or anything like
Yeah.
that?
Yeah. Well, my favorite part of this whole story is that it is so easy for everybody out there to do things to help support our native bees. And they're the things that you just said. Very simple things. Number one, plant more native plants. This is something the National Wildlife Federation has been advocating for and educating people about since 1973 with our Garden for Wildlife movement. And it remains true. Native plants and native wildlife co-evolve together, and they are like two pieces of a puzzle. And the more we can restore those indigenous plant communities, and they're going to be different, hopefully people all across the country and the world are listening, right? Wherever you live, you have a palette of native plants that
Mhm.
evolved where you are, that are adapted to your conditions, and they are adapted to the use of the local wildlife. And so that includes our native bees. And I mentioned that a good chunk of our native bees, I see different statistics, anywhere from like 30 to 60% of our native bees are a fun word, oligolectic. And what that means is that they are pollen specialists.
Okay.
So, I think more people are probably aware of how butterflies and moths, their caterpillars can only eat certain plants. Those are the caterpillar host plants for that
Mhm.
species. The classic example is the monarch butterfly. The only
Right.
thing monarch caterpillars can eat is milkweed, right? So that means they've specialized. So these native bees, a huge percentage of them are pollen specialists. That means they can only feed their babies the pollen from very specific native plant species.
Mhm.
And just like with butterflies and moths, if you don't have their caterpillar host plant present somewhere in the landscape, they can't complete their life cycle and they don't live around you and their populations go down. So native plants are really, really key in supporting our wild native bees. And again, the National Wildlife Federation, we have a ton of resources on this. So I'm going to just shout out our website. It's nwf.org, National Wildlife Federation.org/garden. And that'll take you to what we call our native plant habitat work, right? And there you will find all sorts of plant lists under the resources section. And we have some plant lists that are specifically designed to help support, the plants that have the biggest value to some of these pollen specialist bees. So if you're looking for a plant list, you can go do that. But just going back to native plants in general, when I started at the National Wildlife Federation 26 years ago, I can't believe it's been that long, in the year 2000, and out there, I was originally, came to NWF to work in this native plant habitat space and our backyard habitat work, all of that, and so I've been talking about this for quite a while. And back, 15 years ago, when I asked people the question, like, are you familiar with native plants? Now, back in the day, no one would raise their hand. Today, so many people will raise their hand when I ask that question when I'm out there doing in-person talks, and that is huge.
Yeah.
So, I mentioned that because a lot of the news is bad when it comes to conservation, as you know, right? There's just not a lot. There's a lot of decline of species and habitat destruction, and it's really hard to turn that around. And I just find that little anecdote that I can share with everybody listening, like, it does matter. It matters that we're talking about this. It matters that we're out there talking to people and engaging them and, raising awareness and educating. And I have seen it in the course of my career. I have seen the needle move in that awareness, right? Today, you can open up any gardening magazine, any gardening website, any social media, garden influencer, right? And they're talking about native plants. You can go into most even big nurseries, maybe not the big box nurseries, but
Right.
Your local garden center, almost certainly they're going to have like a native plant section. So my point with mentioning that is, like, you can get native plants nowadays a lot more easily than you could even a decade or so ago. And so, for everybody out there listening, it's springtime. May is Garden for Wildlife Month. It is the perfect time in most places in this country to make that commitment to, plant some more natives. Maybe you don't have room. So the other thing that I like to tell people to do in May is to give over a little piece of your lawn. Maybe make one new garden bed this month, right? Or during the month of May, and plant some natives there, right? And don't get caught up, we're talking about bees and I'm dropping, oligolectic pollen, don't worry about that if you're just beginning. Literally just planting native plants is going to be an incredible first step. And likely those native plants will be, supporting some of our native bees. And as you get more into it and you learn more and you access all the great resources that are out there online and in books and whatever, like, you'll learn, right? You'll pick up some things. And again, it's hard to say, like, plant this, because it's going to be different wherever you live, right? Because again, we have different ecoregions and different native plant species that grow there. But yeah, so that's the number one thing. Plant more native plants, reduce the size of your lawn as much as possible in favor of, native wildflowers and native trees and shrubs, many of which bloom, right? And are important pollen and nectar sources for our native bees. In fact, a lot of our, fruit trees are specifically evolved with our native bees, so and not even just the native ones, the cultivated ones too, apples and nectarines and pears and all of those, right? A lot of berries rely on native bees to pollinate them. All of the brambly stuff, so the blackberries and the raspberries and elderberries and all of those things rely on largely native bees to be doing the pollination. So plant natives, and that's like a very simple thing. It's almost like I don't even have to think anymore. Like, I can do this one thing and know that it is making a difference. And even better, it's also going to be supporting all the other wildlife out there, the butterflies, the moths, because some of those native plants are going to be caterpillar host plants. And as we talked about in the beginning, 96% of our backyard birds are feeding their babies a diet of 100% insects and other invertebrates that need those native plants. If you don't have the native plants, the birds don't have anything to feed their babies. So
Yeah.
it's like a triple, quadruple, whatever else whammy when you plant natives. You're really helping everything in your local ecosystem. So that's number
Yeah.
one. And
Real
number
quick
two,
before you go to number
yeah,
2, I want to just reiterate and reinforce what you said about being able to find native plants in your area. I know here in San Diego, there are a few nurseries that they had a little corner of native plants, and I can say over the years that corner has become a section now.
yeah,
And
yeah,
the general interest, there are still garden centers and nurseries that don't have native plants, and I really want to encourage you, if you go to one that does not, start asking the staff there if they know of a facility or a place or
right.
supplier that has them. The more we speak up about it, the more we inquire, the more they're going to be like, maybe we should have some also. But then you can also then find by asking and speaking up and inquiring more. So
Yeah,
definitely,
100%.
native plants are so important. And again, we're talking about bees, just like you said, David, but the thread that goes all the way through to every other bit of wildlife in our area. And I'll say this too, as someone who's moved into a place that did not have native plants and then planted native plants, you'll be amazed how quickly these butterflies and bees and birds find what you have planted.
Totally.
They usually
Absolutely.
show up within the season, and then there's more the next season and more after that. So it's really a lot of fun, especially if you have kids. Let's like explore and figure out what our native wildlife is like. You put these plants in place and they show up.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to be corny and to use the line from Field of Dreams, if you build it, they will come. Like if you
There-
plant it, they will come.
yeah.
But that it's so important that we do plant it, because the less native plants that are out there, the longer that goes on, the less likely there's going to be a population
Right. Population
of
goes away.
those pollinators to
Yep.
come.
Yeah.
So
Okay. So what's number
100%.
2?
Yeah, well, I'm so glad you said that, and I forgot to mention too,
Oh.
that you don't have to be a botanist, right? You don't have to do a bunch of
Yeah.
research. There are, and the National Wildlife Federation included, we spun off a for-profit plant business called Garden for Wildlife, where you can actually go and get, purchase online all around the country, native plants for your region that we have curated to be what we call keystone plants. So these are plants that have like the biggest bang in terms of habitat value. And again, we want to make it easy, right? We'll deliver them to your door, the top plants. And of course, they're all in collections. So you can get the bee collection or the firefly collection or the butterfly collection or the shade collection. We want to make it easy for people. So you can do that kind of thing. There's tons of mail order options out there today. You can go to your local nursery. And I just want to really underscore what you said, Rick. Use your voice, right? The power of a consumer is a million times more potent than an advocate and an educator like myself or you, right? Like I can be talking till I'm blue in the face. Plant native, it's really important. The nurseries don't care about me, right? But if I go in as a customer and I even just ask the question, hey, do you guys carry native plants? If enough of us do that, guess what? They're going to carry native plants because they want to support their customers.
Yeah.
Customer demand is huge. So please, yes, everybody use your voice. So go to the local nursery. You can shop online. There's tons of really incredible native plant societies that, they do plant swaps, and you can get local ecotypes, which is the gold standard, the wild kinds of natives that are out there growing in the woods and the fields and whatever. So plant native, it's a lot easier than it used to be. And it's really important. So yes, the second thing that we can all do is stop spraying the pesticides. I'll say it again. Please stop spraying the pesticides. And pesticides, there's just any kind of substance that kills things, right? So insecticides are pesticides, herbicides are pesticides, rodenticides are pesticides, and so on, right? So in my opinion, I would say 99% of the time, there are better solutions for the home landscape than resorting to, these toxic chemicals. And, just because something is botanical or plant-based or quote unquote organic, that doesn't necessarily mean it's okay, right? And this is another thing, like a consumer education thing that I think is really important to understand. There are synthetic chemicals, well, actually, let me back up. Everything's a chemical.
Right.
Right. So everything's a chemical. So when we fall into this thing, oh, chemicals, they're bad, that's not really accurate scientifically. So yeah, the synthetic chemicals can be worse because they do tend to persist longer. in the environment and kill more things than maybe botanical based pesticides or organic ones. But even those, are gonna kill. So if you have
Right,
a
and they're non-discriminatory.
right,
So
well,
if
some of
you're
them are
spraying, well, some can be specialized, but in
right,
general, if you're spraying for one species, or there's also the fertilizers that have an insecticide that you put, the plant
right,
soaks it up. So
right,
no matter who eats it or visits the flower, you may not kill them initially, but they could become
right,
a shorter lifespan, or over time going to these different plants. There's
right.
so much. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm stealing your thunder here, but I'm just like,
No,
oh,
no,
I
not at
hate
all,
it.
not
I
at all.
hate it.
Because this is what I was going to say next. Is like, so when it comes to the insecticides, right? There are the ones that you just spray, right, and you just spray
Yeah.
on top of the plant or whatever. But kind of more insidiously, there is a group of pesticides, insecticides called neonicotinoids.
Hmm.
Um, Again, another jargony term for everybody out there. You don't even necessarily even need to know that. What you need to know is that neonicotinoids are systemic. So when a plant is treated with them, every part of the plant, not just the spot that you sprayed, absorbs those insecticides, and they are broad spectrum, meaning that they'll kill any insect that consumes any part of that plant, including the nectar, including the pollen. And again, you said this too, even if it doesn't kill that insect outright, it can weaken their immune system, make them more susceptible to disease, shorten
Yeah.
their lifespan. So it has an impact. So for everybody listening, as a consumer, what you want to do is ask before you purchase and say, were these plants treated with systemic insecticides or pesticides, whatever term you want to use? And if the nursery can't answer that, don't buy the plant. Because unfortunately, even our native plants that are, cultivated and widely available, oftentimes are treated just like all the other garden plants, right?
Yeah.
Just because
So
it's a
one fell
native plant
swoop.
doesn't guarantee that it was not treated with a neonicotinoid systemic insecticide. And, it is true that the neonicotinoids are a lot better in some regard than some of the older types of pesticides that, again, people could get on their skin or they would persist for longer amounts of time in the environment. But anything that ends in side, that means to kill, right? So
Right.
just be really, really thoughtful and mindful about it. Pesticides are a tool. We sometimes use them in conservation, like if we have to take care of a really bad infestation of a non-native invasive plant species or whatever. So I'm not trying to be militant or super black and white. There are shades of gray here, right? Maybe you do have an infestation of a really bad invasive plant on your property. And the only way for the greater good, for the ecosystem to manage that is to use some herbicide. So what I would say in that scenario is if you have exhausted all the tried and true organic gardening techniques, like, hand picking and cutting and all of that kind of stuff, um, try to pick something that is targeted, and you can get certain pesticides that really only affect a specific insect or group of insect, or specifically target plants but have very low toxicity to other things. So again, do a little bit of research on that. One great example is bt, which is a kind of soil bacteria called bacillus thuringiensis. Again, I'm dropping a lot of big words here today, but these are soil bacteria that, when consumed by insects, will kill them. But there are all these different strains of BT, so you can get one that just targets, for example, mosquitoes. So this is like if you have a water garden,
Hmm.
you can buy those mosquito dunks or the mosquito bits. Those that is BT, and it's the strain Israeliensis that only will kill the larva of mosquitoes and a few other sort of pest species of flies. So like fungus gnats, if you have house plants, you know what I'm talking about. Fungus
Yeah.
gnats, they get in the soil if you overwater, and then they are flying around your house and driving you crazy. They don't really cause any harm to anything, but you can also use the BT Israeliensis strain. And there are other strains that will, target different, like if you have to, and I'm telling you, you probably don't have to, try to do a little bit of research and find one of those that is the least toxic. Speaking
Yeah.
of mosquitoes, I'm going to get on a soapbox for a second. That is that I am seeing in the last few years a huge increase and the number of people who are hiring sometimes specialty companies that will come and spray your whole yard and to kill the mosquitoes, right? And so I just have to remind everybody that when they're spraying your yard to kill the mosquitoes, they are using broad spectrum synthetic pesticides, insecticides, a group of pesticides called pyrethroids, which are synthetic versions of a botanical insecticide that comes from chrysanthemums called pyrethrin. Doesn't matter, right? They're spraying this everywhere, and any insect that comes in contact with it is going to die. And they specifically spray it all over your plants, all around the perimeter of your yard, right? There's
Yeah.
even some research showing that it's actually not good for us as, your
I
kids
can only
and
imagine.
pets and whatever, right? So just be really mindful of that. And please do not
Yeah.
believe their marketing claims. They're like, oh yeah, these are pollinator safe. Absolutely not true. Flat out lie,
Yeah.
So don't believe that. Please do not do that. There are way better ways that you can avoid mosquito bites. And I actually have a whole section on this in my book. We've got articles up on National Wildlife Federation's website.
Well, what's the book? You can't just say you've got it in your book and not tell us the book.
So my book is called Attracting Birds, Butterflies, and Other Backyard Wildlife. A little
Ooh,
bit
I
of a
like it.
mouthful, but the idea is it's a how-to book that will walk you through step by step all the things you need to do to create what we call a natural habitat garden or a wildlife habitat garden. That's going to provide natural sources of food and water and cover and places to raise young for everything from songbirds to bees and butterflies to reptiles and amphibians, if that's your jam, right? And so it walks you through chapter by chapter, each thing that each of those categories of things and all the different ways that you can create that habitat in your own yard. And then, of course, that all leads to what we hope folks will do once they create that habitat is to get that space, that garden space, whether it's your yard or a balcony where you have a container garden or your rooftop or your local community garden, wherever. We want people to apply to have that recognized as what we call a certified wildlife habitat garden with the National Wildlife Federation. Basically means you just sort of join the movement, and you can get a yard sign and you put that out and it helps spread the word in a super grassroots kind of way. Again, there's only so many of talks that I can give and media interviews that I can give. So
Yeah.
if you are into this stuff and you really care, doing the whole certified wildlife habitat thing is a really fantastic way of paying it forward and spreading the word.
Yeah.
The bees and the butterflies and the birds, they can't read the sign, right? It has not, like the most important thing is you create the habitat. But when you do that extra step and you kind of join our program, you really become part of this grassroots movement that, again, we started back in 1973 at the National Wildlife Federation, just trying to get people to think a little bit more about how can I have less of a negative impact, right? What are these simple things that I can do that will make a huge difference on that super local level? This whole thing is the epitome of that old environmentalist, sort of this phrase, think globally, act locally. And that is one of the most powerful things about this whole thing, this whole natural gardening movement for me, is that there's very little that I can do as an individual that's gonna, I don't know, save polar bears or save lions, which are rapidly disappearing, right? Like I can do things, but it's largely, donating and, using my voice and, being an activist and that kind of thing. When with all of these groups of wildlife, again, attracting birds, butterflies, and other backyard wildlife, the title of my book, it's all of these wildlife species that can safely coexist right alongside us, right in the middle of our cities, towns, and neighborhoods, literally right outside our doors, if we just give them a little bit of habitat, right? And that boils down to planting natives, don't spraying pesticides. If each of us did that, even in a little small way, we would exponentially increase the amount of habitat and we would see more beautiful songbirds and hear them, right? We would be seeing more beautiful butterflies. We would be seeing more of these native bees doing this really incredibly important ecological work of pollinating nature, right? That's feeding everybody else up and down the food webs, including us. And I did, I talked a lot about honeybees and how they're agriculturally important. A lot of our native bees are too. So,
right. Of course. Yes. Yeah.
Bumblebees are used, to pollinate a lot of different crop plants. There's a kind of bee called a blueberry bee. Guess what that pollinates?
I'm
right?
going to go with blueberries.
Yeah, commercially, right? So, orchard bees, mason bees are out there pollinating fruit trees, and some of these wild native bee species are actually way more efficient at pollinating than honeybees are. And so they're also agriculturally important, and some of them are actually managed like some of the mason bees in the same way that the honeybees are. But largely, it's the wild bees that are out there not only pollinating the plants in nature, but supporting the pollination of our own crops.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it really is that simple: is plant more natives, don't spray pesticides. It's Garden for Wildlife month in May, so it's the perfect time to, like, again, join the movement, get that garden space certified, get the yard sign, put it out there. A lot of people like getting the recognition too, and that's partly why we've always had this sort of aspect of the program. It's really the recognition. We want to tell people, like, you are doing something awesome, and recognize that. So that's really what it's all about. And of course, we always, we have all sorts of, like, cool content and discounts on purchasing the yard signs. We've got a bunch of different kinds of yard signs. So there's kind of big fancy ones, and then there's more low key ones. And I'll say too, we're a nonprofit. We do sell those signs only to people who get their garden certified. It's one of the ways we raise money. That money goes right back into our programs. And so you can feel good about spending that money on the yard sign.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So as we're winding down here, I want to make sure. So you mentioned the Garden for Wildlife website
Yep.
for being able to order native plants that are for your region, for your area, specific for whatever you might be looking for. Where else can people go? So the National Wildlife Federation, is it just
It's just
nwf.org?
NWF, National Wildlife
Okay.
Federation.org/garden. And there you will get links to our native plant finder, which I didn't mention yet. You can put your zip code in, and this native plant finder is basically the research of Dr. Doug Tallamy. And if
Wow.
anybody is already into native plants, you know who Doug is. He's an
Right.
entomologist who is one of the few scientists that are actually studying and producing data, looking at the impact of native plants in sort of the human landscape
Mhm.
on wildlife, specifically insects. And so Doug wrote a book, 12, 15 years ago, called Bringing Nature Home. And it was for the Mid-Atlantic. And what it was, he produced a list of these keystone plants, specifically for butterflies and moths as their caterpillar host plants. So, like, it kind of blew everyone's mind because nobody really thought about, I don't know, oak trees as being critically important for butterflies. But it turns out oaks, the genus Quercus, is a hugely important caterpillar host plant. Over 500, it's something like 557 species of butterflies and moths use oaks as their caterpillar host plant, right? So, like, when you're planting a butterfly garden, everybody thinks, oh, plant all the pretty flowers, and that's important.
Yeah.
That's a nectar source for the adults. But you also want to think about that fourth component of habitat: food, water, places to raise young, right? That is, you need the host plants, right? And it's the same for the bees. So anyway, on nwf.org/garden, you can find the native plant finder. You'll get that list of native plants to your zip code based on science that are the
Nice.
keystone plants for butterflies and moths. You can access, there's a link to Garden for Wildlife native plant, the retail line. So you can order, kits of native plants, and we'll mail them to you, that we've done all the hard work for you already. You know that they're going to be really good plants. We
Yeah.
have a million articles and tip sheets and downloadable PDFs of plant lists, regional information. All of that stuff is there. There's also links there to buy my book, which you can get from any bookstore. Just ask for it. Attracting Birds, Butterflies, and Other Backyard Wildlife. It is a book that the portion of the proceeds go back to support the National Wildlife Federation's book, our programs, our wildlife programs. So again, you can feel good about it. But it's a simple, if you want to learn more, I wrote it so that newbies would pick it up, and it would be really easy. But also, if you're, already a little bit experienced, I think there'll be some fun things in there that maybe you'll learn for the first time. So there's links.
And it's a great gift too for those that are seasoned in this type of stuff. It's a great gift for them to give. Like, here's part of my passion. I want you to learn more about that, for them to give to someone who's just learning. So
Absolutely.
yeah,
And
great
Mother's Day
resource.
is right around the corner too. So it's a great Mother's Day
resource.
gift.
So if people want to
the-
find you, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say, I'm going to say it one more time: nwf.org/garden. And again, a wealth of resources there. And we're also on social media too. So you can follow the National Wildlife Federation. It's either NWF or National Wildlife, depending on the platform. Garden for Wildlife, the retail native plants, has a huge footprint on social media. I do a lot of live streams with them and collabs on social, so they're a great one to follow as well. And I, of course, am on all of the socials as well.
That's what I was going to ask next. Where
Yeah.
can people find you if they want to find
Pretty
you?
much everywhere. So, write my name down, because I'm usually, on most platforms, I'm D for David, and then my whole last name. Probably not the best because it's hard to remember how to spell my last name.
Well, I'll have
But
links in
Dina
the show
Zajewski-
notes, so don't
Yeah.
worry.
But yeah, you can find me anywhere, Facebook, Blue Sky, Instagram, TikTok, etc., YouTube. And yeah, I love interacting with folks. So ask questions, reach out. Again, if you want to do a collab and help get the word out, I'm totally game. So yeah. And it's, again, I just want to emphasize how easy this is. And it's such a feel good thing, especially in these times where, political upheavals and strife, and there's a lot of bad stuff going on in the world. And to know that we all have the power to do something really, really basic and simple, literally right outside our door, that not only is going to make a big difference in the ecosystem, but like you're going to get to see the results of your effort. I guarantee it. And nothing is more inspirational than that experience of trying to do something good and then having the good happen right before your eyes. I mean, that lifts people up so much. And, even if you don't care about the bees, right? Like, do this. And when you see the bee show up, I guarantee you, your heart's going to grow, 3 sizes right there in that instant.
Yeah. Well, this has been, as always, a wonderful talk, David. I can't thank you enough for taking the time. And I love the fact that, we're heading right. So this is the end of April when this episode comes out. So we're heading into the month of May, which is a big garden kickoff for you guys there at NWF. And so a couple episodes back, I was talking to Griffith, and he was talking about how important native plants are, and that it's actually good when the insects are eating them, because that means the caterpillars are getting their food and, all of that. So it's just another great resource for people, your book, the websites, everything else. Thank you so much for what you do. I know we've known each other for a while, but I always have admired you and appreciate the work you do, and the work anyone does when they show up day after day after day, not because they're getting paid, but because this is their passion, which is very clear with you, David. So thank you for all you do, and thank you for taking the time to sit down and have this conversation with me today.
Well, I appreciate you saying that, Rick, and back at you. And yeah, I, as you can tell, I love talking about this stuff. So we got to come up with what we're going to talk about next. So be thinking.
All right. Something maybe in the summer, before we get to fall.
Maybe, the summertime, there's a National Moth Week in the summer. So maybe I can come back and talk about moths.
Yes, let's do that.
So fascinating.
I know, right?
I'm going to go on a whole tangent on moths right now, so stop me.
I know, right? And the thing about moths is that there's so many cool species that people don't realize are right there in their own neighborhood, because we're sleeping at nighttime when most of those species are active. But there's also some daytime moths too. So there's so much to talk about.
And those darn butterflies hog up all the attention, just like the honeybees do, because they're big and pretty and they fly during the day. But there's a lot of secrets that about moths that people don't know on how they're actually even way more important as pollinators and in the ecosystem than butterflies are. And so you really want to be planting those moth gardens, not just butterfly gardens.
All right. So I think we've got our next topic. We've got our next topic, buddy. That's awesome. All right. Well, thanks again, man. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
And of course, thank you, dear listeners. I appreciate you joining me today with this conversation with David. And David and I, as we wrapped up the interview, talked about the different websites and social media platforms you can find more information. And this is great information. It's so impactful. We talk about often how our own little actions in our own little ecosystem can make a difference. This is it. This is a great way, your garden space, your patio, your balcony, your school, your office, wherever it might be, that you can plant these native plants. All that information, all those links, everything we talked about are in the show notes below. Animals, Nature, and You has its own presence on Instagram as well, so the link is there for that. Please feel free to join me there, or myself. You can get my website, zoologyrick.com, or Zoology Rick on just about any social media platform that I'm active on. All of that to say, too, don't forget about fan mail. If you're listening to this podcast on a podcast player, go to the show notes. That very first link says fan mail. That's a way to get a hold of me directly. You can text or leave a voicemail. I don't see your number, so privacy is all involved. Don't worry about that. But I put that in there because I recognize not everybody's on social media. Sometimes you take a break from social media, or sometimes you're just flat out done with it, and I totally get it. So I want another way for us to stay in touch. With that, I want to wrap this up because we had a nice, long, robust conversation with David and so much great information. I encourage you to share this episode with people in your family, in your life, people you work with, people you know have yards that could have a makeover of natural plants. It is such great information, fascinating to learn all about those bees, but also that reminder of how much we can do in our own yard, in our own space. And he gave out information on how you can access stuff specific to your environment, your area code, your zip code, your space. So it's not just one thing fixes all. We need to be specific to our native plants, and he has all that information on those websites. All right, we're going to wrap this up. Again, I want to say last thing, make sure you follow or subscribe so you don't miss any of our upcoming episodes. Every Thursday, great interviews like our interview today, and every Tuesday, our 10-Minute Tuesday, which either reflection back to a species we talked about or something important in current events regarding nature, wildlife, animals, or maybe even you. All right. Have a good one, everybody.